One footstep in the night, heard twice. But why? Welcome to Mystery Sherlock. I am your host, Edward Sterling. Comment below where you're listening from. Your messages mean a lot. Now the mystery unfolds. It is, perhaps, an injustice to memory that London's quietest mornings are the ones most readily forgotten. The city, when the fog lies low and the streets keep their secrets, has a way of smoothing yesterday into anonymity, of making even the extraordinary appear, from a distance, like common soot upon brick. Yet there was a morning in late November, one of those pale, colourless days when the lamps still burned at 10 and the hansoms went by like ghosts that would not be smoothed away. Dr. John Watson lately returned to a more settled life in Baker Street. It would in after years recall it with a particular unease. The sense that something had entered their rooms before any knock had sounded, and that it had left behind, upon the very air, the faint impression of a footstep. Not a tread heard plainly upon the stair, nor the familiar impatient rap of Lestrade, rather something subtler, a rhythm in the silence, a repetition that did not belong. Mrs. Hudson, who had long since ceased to be astonished by the visitors her lodger attracted, came in at 11:15 bearing a card upon her tray. She was composed, but there was that little stiffening about her mouth which Watson had learned to read as a warning. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. He asks particularly that it be private." Holmes, who lay at that time upon the sofa with his long and nervous fingers steepled beneath his chin, did not at once move. The coal fire hissed softly, the chemical apparatus upon the side table gave off the clean scent of spirits. Watson had been writing an innocent account of a case involving a missing governess when the card appeared. Holmes took it with an absent air, held it to the light as though the paper itself might betray more than the ink, and allowed the corner of his mouth to lift by a fraction. "Ah," said he, "this is either going to be very dull or very interesting." Watson, who knew that Holmes reserved the word dull for most human anxieties, and the word interesting for those few which suggested hidden machinery beneath them, laid down his pen. The card was plain, of good stock, with the name engraved in neat capitals, Mr. Algernon Vane, Vane and Sutherland, solicitors, at Lincoln's Inn. Beneath, in a hand that had tried and failed to remain steady, was pencilled a matter of urgency. "I beg you, by all means, see me alone." Holmes's grey eyes flicked to Watson, not with secrecy, but with that quick calculation which always seemed to measure the shape of a problem before it was spoken. "Private," Holmes murmured, and then, after the briefest pause, which generally means public with embarrassment attached, "Pray, Watson, remain. If Mr. Vane has anything worth our attention, he will soon forget his scruples." He nodded to Mrs. Hudson. "Show him up." A minute later there came the sound of steps upon the stair, brisk at first, then hesitant at the last few rises, as though the man above might be less forgiving than the man below. The door opened, and a thin gentleman entered, who looked as if he had been made of the very paper upon which he wrote his petitions. Algernon Vane was perhaps 35, with a high, worried brow, and that pallor peculiar to men who spend their days beneath gaslight, and their nights under the weight of other people's affairs. His clothes were correct to the point of nervousness. His gloves, which he carried rather than wore, had been folded and refolded until the leather creased. He bowed to Holmes, glanced at Watson with a momentary tightening about the eyes. "The doctor is here," and then seemed to abandon any hope of privacy at all. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said. Holmes rose with that languid grace which gave the impression of courtesy without effort. "At your service." "Pray sit down, Mr. Vane." You have walked from Lincoln's Inn. Vane blinked.
Yes, I did not wish. He stopped, swallowed, and tried again. Yes, I walked. Holmes waved his hand as if dismissing the obvious. You wished to avoid a hansom for fear of being followed, and you chose the Strand and then the smaller streets to lessen the chance of recognition. You are, however, followed all the same. The effect upon Vane was immediate. His face emptied of colour. He half rose, looking towards the window, as though expecting to see a dark figure pressed against the glass. Watson, for his part, had seen Holmes do such things 100 times and still felt that old prickling along the scalp which came with them. Vane had not said he feared pursuit. Yet it was there in him, written perhaps upon the way his eyes kept flitting to the door, or the manner in which his breathing failed to settle. Holmes leaned towards him.
Almost kindly. Do not distress yourself. The man who follows you is no more dangerous than the average clerk, and considerably less imaginative. He is seated now in the coffee house opposite, pretending to read a newspaper which is upside down. Vane stared. Then, with the abruptness of a man forced to choose between panic and reason, he sank back into the chair. How can you know that? Holmes's smile had the faintest edge of amusement. Because the cuffs of your coat bear a fresh smear of printer's ink, not from your own office, but from the Daily Chronicle vendor at the corner of Fleet Street. A man with the habit of following others will purchase the one thing that allows him to sit and watch without remarking himself: a newspaper. And because when you entered this room, you did not look at me first,
But over my shoulder, towards the window. You expected to be observed. Vane pressed his gloved hands together until the knuckles showed through the leather. Then it is true. I am being watched. Almost certainly, said Holmes. And now tell me why. There are men, Watson had observed, who can confess a crime with less effort than they can confess fear. Vane was of that breed. He opened his mouth, closed it, and for a moment looked very much like a drowning man deciding whether the water was preferable to the shore. At last he spoke, and his voice, once it found its channel, came out in a swift, clipped stream. 3 nights ago, Mr. Holmes, one of my clients was murdered. Holmes did not change expression, but Watson saw the slight sharpening of attention, like a hound lifting its head. A client? Holmes asked. Name? Mr.
Theodore Charters, said Vane, of Charters House, Kensington, a gentleman of independent means. Watson knew the name faintly, as one knows the titles of grand houses glimpsed from a carriage window. Charters House stood, if memory served, behind iron gates and a clipped line of elms, with that peculiar air of money which suggests generations rather than accounts. The newspapers say it was a burglary, Vane went on quickly. They say the thief was disturbed, that Mr. Charters struggled, that he was struck down. Scotland Yard, Inspector Lestrade among them, believes it to be plain. Holmes's eyes did not leave Vane's face. And you do not? I cannot, whispered Vane, because of the footstep. Watson leaned forward. The footstep? Vane's lips were dry. He moistened them, and one could see the effort it cost him to continue. I was at Charters' house that evening, Mr. Holmes. I went at Mr. Charters' request. He wished to amend his will. Holmes' fingers moved a fraction as if counting silently. You altered it? Said he. No, that is to say, yes, we spoke of alterations, but he did not sign. He was unsettled. He said he had been receiving odd messages, anonymous notes, nothing definite, but threats implied rather than stated. He asked if such things were actionable. I advised him to inform the police. Vane's laugh was thin. He refused. He said the police were for the poor and the foolish. Holmes's mouth twitched. And yet you are here. Vane bowed his head, because he is dead, and because I was there when he died. Watson felt the room tighten as though the air itself had been drawn in. You were in the house at the time? Watson asked. So I was leaving, said Vane. It was nearly 10. Mr. Charters had shown me out of his study and into the hall. The servants had retired. His sister, Miss Cecily Charters, was upstairs with a headache, or so she said. His butler, Mr. Rook, had taken the lamps down to the lower hall. Everything was quiet. Vane's eyes fixed upon a point just above Holmes's shoulder, not seeing the sitting-room at all, but some darker corridor in Kensington. And then, he said, I heard a footstep behind me. Holmes' voice was very soft. A single footstep. A footstep, Vane repeated, as if someone had put their heel down upon the stone of the hall. I turned, expecting to see Mr. Rook, or perhaps Mr. Charters, following with a final instruction, but there was no one. Watson frowned. A creaking board, then?
Or a settling of the house. That is what I told myself, Vane replied with sudden intensity. That is what I told myself until it happened again. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Again? Vane nodded, and the movement made the light catch on the sweat along his temples. I took 3 steps towards the door. I had my hand upon the latch. Then behind me the same footstep, Mr. Holmes, in the same place. As if a man had walked once, and then, after I had moved, had walked again upon the very same stone. Watson felt, absurdly, the urge to glance behind him at their own carpeted floor, as though a sound might echo there too. And still you saw no one? Holmes asked. No one, Vane said. Yet I could not shake the certainty that I was not alone. I turned fully. I even called out. Mr. Charters? Nothing answered. Holmes's gaze dropped briefly, as if picturing the hall. The door to the study? Closed, said Vane. I had seen him close it. And the lamps? 2 were lit, Vane replied. 1 in the hall, 1 on the table near the stair. Holmes' voice remained calm. Continue. Vane's hands tightened around his gloves. I left, he said. I did not run. I wish I could say I ran, but I left in what I believed was a dignified manner. Outside, the night was cold. There was fog. I walked to the corner and hailed a cab. He swallowed hard. Before the cab came, I looked back at the house. One of the upstairs windows was lit. Miss Charter's room, I suppose. And then I saw a shadow pass across the ground floor curtains. Holmes's eyes flashed. Ah! Vane's voice became a hoarse whisper. I did not go back. I told myself it was a servant.
I told myself anything that would allow me to get into the cab. And the next morning, Watson said gently, he was found dead. Vane nodded once. He was found in his study, he said. The safe was open, papers were scattered, there was blood on the hearthrug, his skull was fractured. The police say a thief entered by the garden window. They say the thief fled before the servants rose. His eyes met Holmes's at last, full of miserable certainty. But Mr. Holmes, said Algernon Vane, I tell you the thief did not flee before I left. I heard him twice. I heard the same footstep, as if the house itself were rehearsing a murder. Holmes was silent for a moment. He reached for his pipe, but did not light it. The unlit pipe, held between his fingers, looked oddly like a conductor's baton, an instrument poised to draw music out of chaos. And what of the will? Holmes asked at last. Vane's throat worked. That is, he hesitated. That is why I have come. Holmes's eyes lifted. because it was changed after your visit." Vane's face crumpled with something very close to despair. "Yes," he whispered, "it was changed, and signed, and witnessed." Watson's heart sank. "But you said—" "I said he did not sign while I was there," Vane cried. "He did not, I swear it. Yet when the will was produced, yesterday, Mr. Holmes, it bore his signature. It bore 2 witnesses. It bequeaths the bulk of his estate not to his sister, as his former will did, but to an institution, the St. Bartholomew's Foundling Fund." Holmes' expression did not soften, but it sharpened further, like steel being honed. "And the witnesses?" he asked. "One is Mr. Rook, the butler," Vane said.
"Yeah, the other is me." The words hung in the room like smoke. Watson half rose from his chair. "You!" Vane's eyes shone with frantic honesty. "It is not mine. That is not my hand. That is not my signature. Yet it is there, Mr. Holmes, so like it that any clerk would accept it, any judge, any jury." He leaned forward, voice trembling. "I am a solicitor," he said. "My name, my livelihood, my liberty hang upon ink." Holmes regarded him steadily. "And you are being followed?" "Yes," Vane breathed. "And I believe, Mr. Holmes, that someone means to make me the murderer." Holmes placed the unlit pipe down with care. "My dear Watson," said he, without taking his eyes from Vane, "we shall have to pay Chartershouse a visit." He paused, and there was, in that brief stillness,
the faintest suggestion of the thing that had troubled Watson since morning, the idea of sound without a source, of an effect without a cause. "A footstep heard twice," Holmes murmured. "How very economical, either a man who wishes to be remembered, or a man who wishes to be misheard." Vane stared at him. "You believe me, then?" Holmes's thin smile returned, sharp as a knife's edge. "I believe," said he, "that you heard something. Whether it was a footstep or a message remains to be seen." And with that the case, which Scotland Yard had already stamped as common burglary, stepped quietly into the realm of the impossible. Holmes was already on his feet, his long coat in his hand and his keen mind, so far as I could judge, 6 streets ahead of his body. And there are moments in our partnership when I have felt myself a mere accessory to his will, like the violin that lay silent until his fingers demanded music. Yet even then, as he moved with that swift certainty which always followed the scent of a genuine problem, I could not help but observe a curious undercurrent. He was not merely interested, he was wary. "You will come with us, Mr. Vane," said Holmes, and there was that in his tone which made it less a request than an arrangement of facts. "Your presence is desirable. If what you say is true, it may also be protective." Vane started. "Protective?" Holmes's eyes flicked to the window. Outside, the fog had thickened into a grey veil, and the opposite house fronts were spectral shapes. Somewhere below, in Baker Street, a cab rattled past with a hollow, distant sound. "All men do not follow you out of idleness," Holmes replied, "and men who counterfeit signatures are rarely scrupulous about preserving the hands that might unmask them. Now, have you the will with you?" Vane fumbled in his inner pocket and produced a folded document, the edges already worn as if he had taken it out and put it away 12 times to convince himself that it was real. Holmes did not unfold it at once. He held it by the corner as though the paper were evidence that might stain him. "I shall look at it presently," said he. "First tell me this. When you were at Charters House, did you handle any papers? Did you write anything? Did you lend your pen?" "No," said Vane eagerly. "Nothing. Mr. Charters spoke of an alteration, but he did not dictate. He paced. He asked questions. He seemed distracted." Holmes nodded, as if this fitted neatly into a pattern only he could see. "And the former will, where is it kept?" "In my office," Vane replied. in a locked cabinet. Only my clerk and I have the key." Holmes's glance was instantaneous. "Your clerk is named?" "Edwin Harker." Holmes made a small, satisfied sound, neither approval nor condemnation, but the recognition of another piece upon the board. He turned to me. "Watson, your revolver." I confess that the request surprised me. Holmes was not given to theatrical precautions. When he armed himself, it was usually because reason demanded it, not drama. Yet his face was composed, even indifferent, as if he had asked for a pencil. I took my service revolver from the drawer and slipped it into my coat pocket, and in doing so noticed that Holmes had already secured his own small, a businesslike weapon in the inner breast. Vane watched these preparations with the wide-eyed alarm of a man who has come to consult a physician and finds a surgeon washing his hands. "Is it so dangerous?" he whispered. Holmes tucked the will into his pocket without looking at it. "London is always dangerous to those who have made themselves useful." Within minutes, we were out upon the street. The fog had a taste to it, coal smoke and damp stone, and it swallowed the distance so that even the familiar curve of Regent Street seemed a corridor leading into nowhere. Holmes hailed a hansom, gave the driver the Kensington address, and we were off, the hoofbeats muffled in the grey. Vane sat opposite me, his fingers worrying his gloves, his eyes darting every time another carriage loomed out of the mist. Holmes beside him appeared to take no notice at all. He leaned back, his chin sunk, his eyes half closed in that attitude of languid repose which I had learned to recognize as his deepest concentration. Once or twice he put his hand to his pocket and touched the folded paper as though confirming its existence. We had not gone far beyond Piccadilly when he spoke again, without opening his eyes. "Mr. Vane, you said you saw a shadow cross the ground-floor curtains as you waited for your cab. What shape was it?" Vane blinked, startled by the question's suddenness. "A shape? How could I tell? It was only a moving darkness." Holmes's eyes opened then, very bright. Was it tall? Was it broad? Did it move smoothly or with a limp? It seemed... Vane frowned, forcing the memory into words. "It seemed narrow, a man's shape." It passed quickly. "And the curtains?" Holmes persisted. "Heavy? Light? Did they cling to the glass or hang away from it?" "They hung away," Vane said slowly. "There is a sort of alcove inside the window, I believe. The curtains are thick, red." Holmes nodded once, as if satisfied with a detail that meant nothing to me. "And you were at the corner long enough to see this shadow. How long did you wait for your cab?" "Perhaps half a minute," Vane answered. "A minute at most." Holmes glanced out through the hansom's little window. "Then whatever crossed that curtain did so within a minute of your leaving the hall." He leaned back again. "Interesting." I could not help it. I asked what had been pressing at me since Vane's confession. "Holmes," said I, "if the will was forged after Mr. Vane left, how could the forger know his signature so precisely? It is no easy thing to imitate a man's hand." Holmes gave me a quick look, not unkindly. "No, Watson, it is not easy. Therefore either the man who forged it has practiced, or he had assistance." "Assistance from whom?" I demanded. Holmes's gaze slid briefly to Vane, who was staring at him as a condemned man might stare at the judge. "From someone with access to Mr. Vane's genuine signature," said Holmes, "and with the leisure to trace it until it became second nature." Vane swallowed. "My clerk." "Possibly," Holmes replied. "Or any man who has handled your correspondence, or a woman who has seen you sign receipts, or—" He paused. or someone who has a reason to place your name upon that paper, and is clever enough to know that a signature is less a flourish than a habit, the cab turned into a broader road. The houses of Kensington rose in dim squares out of the fog, their railings beaded with wet. As we approached the Charters gates, I saw that there were already 2 men standing near the entrance, their silhouettes dark against the paler street. One was unmistakably Inspector Lestrade, short, sharp, his collar turned up, his eyes always looking as if the world had personally offended him. The other was a constable. Holmes stepped down from the cab with that leisurely air which always had the curious effect of making official men appear hurried. Lestrade's face brightened at once, for he could no more resist Holmes than he could resist an unsolved case. "Mr. Holmes," he cried, "why, I might have known you'd have your fingers in this pie. And you too, Doctor. Come to look at my burglary, have you?" Holmes shook his hand as though doing him a favour. "Good day, Lestrade. A burglary, you say? And then I presume you have already arrested your burglar." Lestrade's grin widened. "Not yet, but we've got the right man in mind. A chap named Jabez Pike, housebreaker, known to us, lives over by Notting Hill. There's a footprint in the garden that matches his boot, and a pawnshop ticket for a silver inkstand that came from this very house." Holmes's eyebrows rose. "An inkstand?" "Aye," said Lestrade, pleased with himself. "And it's Charters' inkstand, mind you, initials on it. Pike's been seen hanging about. We'll have him within the day." Holmes' expression remained politely attentive, but I caught that faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth, the sign, in him, of scepticism rather than amusement. "And the will?" Holmes asked, lightly. Lestrade blinked. "The will? What's that to do with it?" "A great deal," said Holmes. "Who found the body?" Lestrade jerked his head towards the house. "The butler? Rook. He came down at 7, saw the study door ajar, went in, and there he was, skull smashed, safe open, papers everywhere, plain enough." Holmes's eyes went past Lestrade, through the iron gates, and rested upon the gravel drive leading up to the dark bulk of Charters' house. The fog clung to the shrubs like cobweb. Even in daylight the place had an air of holding its breath. "And Miss Cecily Charters?" Holmes asked. "In bed," said Lestrade. "Poor thing's all of a tremble. Says she heard nothing. Slept through it all."
"I'd imagine that." Holmes's gaze flicked to Vane. "You hear, Mr. Vane? It is remarkable what people can sleep through." Vane's face was drawn. "Mr. Holmes, please—" Holmes cut him off gently. "One thing at a time." He turned again to Lestrade. "May we go in?" Lestrade shrugged. "You can poke about if you like. Won't change the facts. But mind you don't touch what's already been—" Holmes was already through the gate. As we walked up the drive, my eyes kept straying to the gravel, to the borders where a footprint might lie, to the dark windows where a shadow had moved. Vane lagged a step behind, his head turning constantly as though expecting a hand to seize his collar. Holmes, however, seemed concerned with none of it. He walked with his eyes half upon the ground, half upon the house front,
taking in the smallest things, the pattern of mud upon the steps, the angle of a shutter, the way one curtain hung slightly away from its neighbour. At the very threshold he paused. "Lestrade," said he quietly, "before we go in, tell me, has anyone since the death mentioned hearing a footstep?" Lestrade snorted. "Footsteps? We've heard nothing but nonsense. The servants say they heard a window. The maid says she heard whispers. The sister says she heard a dream. You'll get every tale in London if you listen long enough." Holmes's eyes lifted to the dim upper windows. "And yet," said he, almost to himself, "the house has already told us one tale, twice." Then he stepped inside, and the door closed behind us with a soft, final sound that, in that fog-bound silence, reminded me unpleasantly of a footfall upon stone. and the air within Charter's house was close and faintly sweet, as though the heavy curtains had trapped the night and refused to let it go. A fire smouldered low in the grate of the hall, its embers dull and ashen, giving just enough light to throw long shadows along the polished floor. Holmes paused there, letting his eyes adjust, while Lestrade busied himself with explanations that went unheard. The hall itself was broad, with a checkered stone floor, worn smooth by generations of measured footsteps. A lamp stood upon a small table near the foot of the stairs, its wick turned low. Holmes glanced at it once, and then looked down, very deliberately, at the stones beneath his feet. "This is where you stood," he said quietly, without turning. Vane, who had entered last, started. "Yes."
Near the door? And you heard the sound behind you, Holmes continued, moving a step forward, then another. Here? About there, Vane replied, pointing uncertainly. Holmes retraced the distance with care, placing his feet as though following an invisible pattern. He stopped, turned, and listened. The house was utterly still. No creak, no settling of beams, nothing but the faint tick of a clock somewhere above. Lestrade cleared his throat. "You won't hear ghosts in daylight, Holmes." Holmes did not answer. Instead, he crouched and examined the floor closely, his fingers hovering just above the stone without touching it. To my untrained eye, there was nothing to see, no scuff, no mark, but I knew better than to trust my impressions when Holmes was silent. At length, he straightened. "Mr. Rook," he said suddenly. The butler,
who had been hovering anxiously near the door to the study, stepped forward. He was a tall man with iron-grey hair and a face set into lines of habitual reserve. If he felt alarm at Holmes's penetrating gaze, he did not show it. "You were the first to come down this morning?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir." "You entered the hall by the servants' stair?" "Yes, sir." "And this lamp—" Holmes gestured lightly towards the table. "Was it lit when you came down?" Rook hesitated. "I believe so, sir." Holmes' eyebrows rose. "You believe so?" Yes, I cannot say with certainty. It is usually kept lit through the night." "Usually?" Holmes repeated. "But not always." Rook's lips tightened. "No, sir." Holmes inclined his head, as if acknowledging an answer that was more revealing than intended. He turned then towards the study, whose door stood ajar, as Lestrade had said. The room beyond bore all the marks of an official inspection. Drawers stood open, papers lay in disordered heaps, a strip of chalk marked the position of the body upon the rug before the hearth. The safe gaped from the wall like a broken mouth. Yet even amid this chaos there was a certain tidiness that struck me as odd, though I could not have said why. Holmes crossed the threshold and stood quite still, taking in the room as a whole before approaching any detail. His eyes lingered on the desk, then on the hearth, then on the window, whose heavy red curtains were drawn back. "So," said Lestrade, following him in through the garden window, over the desk, out again. Pike's work, if ever I saw it. Holmes knelt by the hearthrug. "And this," he said, indicating the chalk outline, "is where Mr. Charters fell." "Struck from behind," Lestrade said promptly. "Single blow." Holmes touched the rug lightly. "No signs of a struggle?" "None to speak of." Holmes's fingers moved to the mantelpiece, where several small objects were arranged with a care that seemed incongruous after the rummaging of a thief. A paperweight, a small bronze figure, an empty matchbox. He picked up the matchbox and examined it. "Empty," he murmured. Yet the fire was lit. Lestrade shrugged. "The servants would have—" "Perhaps," said Holmes. He replaced the box precisely where it had been. I found myself drawn to the desk. It was a solid piece of furniture, well worn, with ink stains darkening the wood near the corner. An inkstand sat upon it, modern, plain, and decidedly not silver. I mentioned this to Holmes in a low voice.
The silver one was stolen," said Lestrade. Pawned." Holmes glanced at the inkstand, then at the desk surface around it. "Yes," he said. "So it seems?" He moved then to the safe, peering into its empty interior. "Forced? Pried open," Lestrade answered. "Tool marks." Holmes nodded, though his attention seemed oddly divided. He had returned to the window now and stood looking out into the fog-shrouded garden. The ground below was damp, the earth dark. A constable's chalk mark circled a single footprint near the shrubbery. Holmes did not look at it. Instead, he examined the curtains. They were thick, as Vane had said, and hung from a rod set well back from the glass, leaving a narrow space between fabric and window. Holmes slipped his hand into that space and felt along the sill. "What are you looking for?" Lestrade asked.
With faint impatience. "A reason," Holmes replied. He withdrew his hand and held up his fingers. There was a faint smudge of soot upon them. "The fire was lit," Holmes said softly, "yet the matches were used elsewhere." He stepped back into the room and turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over every face present. Lestrade's brisk confidence, Rook's impassive reserve, Vane's taut anxiety, and finally mine. "Mr. Vane," he said, "when you stood in the hall and heard the footstep, did it sound heavy?" Vane frowned. "No, that is, no heavier than a man's tread, perhaps lighter." "And deliberate?" Holmes pressed. "Yes," Vane said after a moment. "Very deliberate." Holmes nodded as though this confirmed something long suspected. He did not explain it. Instead, he walked back to the hall, beckoning me to follow. Lestrade lingered, grumbling faintly. But allowed us to pass. At the foot of the stairs, Holmes stopped once more, his eyes fixed upon the stone floor. He took a single step, then another, placing his heel down carefully. The sound echoed faintly. He waited. Then, with the same measured motion, he placed his foot again upon the same stone. The sound was identical. Vane inhaled sharply. "That is it," he whispered. "That is exactly it." Holmes straightened. For a brief instant, his face betrayed something like satisfaction, quickly masked. "The house," he said quietly, "is very well made." He turned at last to Lestrade. "Inspector, you may yet catch your burglar, but I advise you not to close your eyes to the possibility that Mr. Pike did not act alone, or perhaps did not act at all." Lestrade bristled. "You think this was no burglary?" "I think," said Holmes evenly, "that it was made to look like one." Lestrade snorted. "You always do." Holmes's gaze slid past him to the staircase, to the dark curve leading upward. "And I think," he added, "that someone in this house knew precisely where to stand in order to be heard and not seen." Vane clutched the banister as though for support. "Then I am not mad," he said hoarsely. "No," Holmes replied, "you are merely early." He glanced up the stairs once more, his eyes alight with that cold, focused brilliance I knew so well. "Come, Watson," he said. "The dead have told us as much as they can for the moment. It is the living who will require more persuasion." And with that, he placed his foot upon the first stair and began to ascend, leaving behind him the echo of a sound that, heard twice, had already begun to reshape the truth. The staircase rose in a dignified curve, its carpet dark and thick, muffling even Holmes's light tread. Yet I observed that he did not mount it as a man merely going from one floor to another. He climbed as one maps a country, eyeing the turn of the rail, the fall of light from the landing, the very angle at which the walls might throw a sound back upon itself. Halfway up, he paused, one hand resting upon the banister. He leaned slightly over the side and looked down into the hall below, where Lestrade and the butler waited like two sentries guarding different kingdoms. "Rook!" Holmes called. "Yes, sir?" The butler's voice rose without strain. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard at a distance. "Kindly stand where Mr. Vane stood on the night of the murder," said Holmes. Rook hesitated only a moment before complying. He moved to the place near the door, his posture erect, his hands folded. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Now speak. Say any common phrase, something you would say to a visitor departing." Rook looked faintly bewildered, but obeyed. "Good evening, sir. I trust you found everything to your satisfaction." The words floated upward and reached us with an odd clarity, as if the stairwell itself had carried them. Holmes nodded once, as though he had expected exactly that. "Thank you," he said. "Now remain there." He turned to me. "Watson, you will note that the hall is an excellent trumpet. A man need not raise his voice to be heard from above, and, more pertinent, a sound made above may be made to seem as though it came from below, if the hearer is placed correctly." I murmured assent, though the full implication of his words still eluded me. We reached the upper landing. Here the air was cooler and the light dimmer, filtered through frosted glass. The corridor stretched to either side, doors set at intervals, each with its brass handle gleaming like an eye. Holmes walked to the nearest door and examined the lock. He did the same to the next. His movements were so swift, so economical, that I could hardly follow the sequence. At the third door he paused and without knocking tried the handle. "It is locked," I whispered. Holmes produced a thin wire from his pocket, inserted it with practised ease, and in moments the lock yielded with a soft click. I confess I felt a twinge of indignation on behalf of the household, but Holmes's expression was wholly absorbed. "Mrs. Hudson would have my ears if she knew," I muttered. Holmes' eyes flicked towards me, amusement briefly lighting them. "Then it is fortunate Mrs. Hudson is not here." He pushed the door open and slipped inside. It was a small sitting room, plainly furnished, with a writing table near the window and a chaise longue along the wall. There were books upon the shelf, religious works, moral essays, a few romances with their titles discreetly turned inward. A faint scent of lavender hung in the air. Holmes crossed to the fireplace and knelt. The grate held the remains of a fire, ash, and among it several half-burned fragments of paper. He held one up delicately. The edge of it was scorched, but the centre still bore a few legible letters in black ink. "Short safe," Holmes read softly. Another scrap showed "Vane," and a third, or will. I stared. Letters? Notes? Holmes's thin lips tightened. Or messages that were meant to be forgotten. He rose and glanced around the room once more, his attention alighting on the writing table. An ink bottle sat there, uncapped. The nib of a pen lay stained beside it, as though recently used and carelessly set down. Holmes lifted the pen, sniffed it, and then, so swiftly I barely caught it, scraped a trace of ink from the nib with his fingernail onto a handkerchief. "Fresh," he murmured. Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Holmes's head lifted sharply. The door opened, and a young woman stood upon the threshold. She was slight, perhaps 25, dressed in black that had been chosen with more propriety than taste. Her face was pale, not from illness, but from sleeplessness, and her eyes, large and dark, held that mixture of pride and fear which is so often the inheritance of women who have lived under another's roof too long. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice trembled. "And what are you doing in my room?" Holmes bowed slightly as if she were hostess, and he but a late caller. "Miss Charters, I presume?" "I am Cecily Charters," she said sharply. Her gaze darted to me, then back to Holmes. "Inspector Lestrade said he would not allow strangers to wander the house." "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes replied, "is a man of admirable diligence who has never yet prevented a disaster from happening. I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are here because your brother's death is not as simple as Scotland Yard would like to believe." At the sound of his name, something flickered in her expression, recognition, and beneath it a guarded calculation. "My brother is dead," she said coldly. "What more do you wish to drag from him?" "The truth," said Holmes gently, "and perhaps your safety." She gave a bitter laugh. "My safety? Mr. Holmes, I have no fortune now. My brother's will has seen to that." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "So you know of the will?" "How could I not?" she replied. "They told me yesterday, a foundling fund, as if Theodore had ever cared for foundlings. He disliked children." Her hands clenched at her sides, the black fabric creasing. Holmes studied her without flinching. "Did your brother amend his will in the last days of his life?" "No," she snapped too quickly. Then she checked herself. "He spoke of it. He was always speaking of changing something, his investments, his servants, his diet. But he did not sign anything in my presence." Holmes inclined his head. "Yet someone burned papers in your fireplace." Her eyes widened in genuine surprise. She glanced at the grate and then back at Holmes, colour rising in her cheeks. "I did not burn anything," she said. "Why would I?" Holmes held up one of the charred fragments. "Because these appear to have been warnings, notes, threats perhaps." Miss Charter's gaze fixed upon the fragment, and for a moment her composure faltered. Then the pride returned, stiffening her shoulders. "My brother received all manner of nonsense," she said. "He had enemies, business rivals, people he had dismissed. It is nothing." Holmes' voice became suddenly very quiet. "Your brother feared something enough to summon his solicitor at night. Enough to speak of anonymous messages."
"Odd enough to refuse the police because he believed the danger was respectable." Miss Charter's lips parted. Her eyes, which had been hard, softened into something very close to fear. "He was agitated," she admitted almost inaudibly. "He said he heard footsteps." Holmes went perfectly still. "In the house?" I asked. She nodded, swallowing. "At night, in the hall, once, twice, always as if someone walked behind him. He told me I was fanciful when I said the house creaked. Then 2 nights before he died, he came to my door and asked if I had been walking about." "And had you?" Holmes asked. "No," she whispered. "I was in bed. I told him so. He stared at me as if he did not believe me." Holmes took a step closer, his gaze intent. "Miss Charters, on the night your brother died, where were you between 9 and midnight?" She drew herself up. "Oh, in my room. Ill. I had a headache." "Did anyone see you?" Holmes pressed. Her face flushed. "My maid, Ellen, brought me laudanum at 10, she can tell you." Holmes nodded slowly. "And you heard nothing?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation I heard more than any words might have conveyed. "I heard," she said finally, "the clock strike. I heard the wind. I heard a sound, like someone moving in the corridor." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A footstep?" She looked at him as if he had put a name to her nightmare. "Yes," she breathed. "A footstep. And then, after a moment, another, in the same place. Vane, who had followed us quietly up the stairs, gave a strangled sound behind me. Holmes did not look back. He kept his eyes upon Miss Charters, and in them was no pity, only that relentless hunger for clarity. "Thank you," he said softly. "That is very valuable." Miss Charters' composure broke at last. She sank onto the chair by the writing table, pressing her fingers to her temple. "What does it mean?" she whispered. "What does any of it mean? Theodore is dead, and everyone looks at me as if I held the knife." Holmes's voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge beneath it. "It means," said he, "that someone has made a sound into a signal, an alarm into a weapon. And it means that the person who did so knew your brother's habits, his fears, and the architecture of this house." He glanced down at the writing table, at the uncapped ink, at the pen laid carelessly aside. "And," he added, "it means that someone has written more than one signature in the last few days." Miss Charter's eyes darted to the pen as if it had suddenly become a serpent.
"Oh, I've written nothing," she said quickly. "Nothing at all." Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the ink bottle. "We shall see." Below in the hall there came the murmur of voices, Lestrade speaking, Rook replying. Then a sharper sound, the opening and closing of the front door. Holmes's head lifted. "They are bringing someone in," he said. And in that instant, as the house seemed to hold its breath once more, I felt that the next turn of the case was already stepping across the threshold. Holmes moved before any of us had fully understood what that sound implied. He crossed the little sitting room in 2 strides, opened the door, and stood listening upon the landing with his head slightly inclined, like a musician catching a distant phrase. From below came Lestrade's voice, brisk and triumphant. "We told you we'd have him!"
"Ah, found him not 10 minutes from here, skulking in a mews with mud on his boots and a ticket in his pocket. Come along, Pike." A second voice rose, rough, protesting, thick with the indignation of the perpetually suspected. "I ain't done nothing, I'm telling you I ain't." Holmes's eyes met mine for an instant. In them I saw not surprise, but a kind of cold anticipation. He turned and gestured us forward. We descended the stairs. Halfway down, Vane's hand brushed my sleeve. "Dr. Watson," he whispered, his breath hurried. "If they have arrested a burglar, does it clear me?" I could not answer him. Holmes's silence was more eloquent than any reassurance I might have offered. In the hall below, Lestrade stood with 2 constables and a man between them, a broad-shouldered fellow with a heavy jaw, a broken nose, and the dull,
but unwatchful eyes of one accustomed to the inside of cells. His coat was stained at the hem, his boots were indeed crusted with fresh mud. He looked about him with sullen defiance, but I observed that even his defiance had a practised air, as though he knew what part was expected and played it as habit. "This is Jabez Pike," Lestrade announced, rubbing his hands together as if warming them at the fire of his own success, "and if ever a face said burglary, it's that one." Pike jerked his chin towards Holmes. "Who's that? Another bleedin' toff come to stare?" Lestrade's chest puffed. "That's Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and you'll mind your tongue." At Holmes' name, something, very faint but unmistakable, passed across Pike's expression. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the same sullen mask, but it was there, recognition, and with it a flicker of caution. Holmes stepped closer, regarding him as a naturalist regards a specimen newly caught. "Good morning, Mr. Pike," said he. "You were in the garden of this house on the night of the murder." Pike spat to one side, but the constable's hand tightened on his arm. "I weren't." Holmes's eyes dropped to the man's boots. Your right boot has a split at the toe repaired recently, with a strip of leather not quite matching the original. The soil wedged into that split is the same heavy loam as the flower bed beneath the study window. That is not Notting Hill mud, Mr. Pike. That is Kensington. Pike's jaw clenched. Maybe I walked through Kensington yesterday. Ain't against the law. Holmes smiled faintly. No, but it is against the law to climb through a gentleman's window. Rifle is safe.
Add and leave with his silver inkstand. At this, Pike threw back his head and laughed, an unpleasant sound in the quiet hall. Silver inkstand, he scoffed. You'd think I was a lord the way you talk. I pawned a thing, that's all. How do you know it came from here? Lestrade thrust a folded paper forward. Because it's got his initials on it, and the pawnbroker said you brought it in yesterday afternoon. Pike's gaze slid over Lestrade, over the constables, and for the briefest moment rested upon Holmes again. I didn't kill nobody, he said, and though his voice was rough, there was now something more urgent in it. I pinched what I pinched, and I'll answer for it, but I didn't crack no skull. Holmes' face did not change. We shall see, said he quietly. Tell me, mister.
Pike, how did you come by the inkstand? Pike hesitated, a fraction too long. I found it, he said at last. Found it where? In a sack, Pike blurted, as if choosing the first lie that came. Near the river. Someone had tossed it. Holmes nodded slowly, as though Pike had confirmed an expectation. Near the river, he repeated. How convenient. And the pawn ticket, was it also near the river? Pike's eyes flashed. I'm not answering riddles. Holmes's voice remained mild. Very well. Then answer this. If you entered this house, why did you do so? Pike's mouth twisted. To take what I could, same as any man without money. And did you enter alone? Pike's expression hardened into stubborn blankness. Alone. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Did you meet anyone in the garden? No. Did you see any light in the study window? Pike's eyes flicked, involuntarily, towards the door of the study, as if the room itself might contradict him. No. Holmes watched that flicker as a cat watches the movement of a mouse beneath cloth. Lestrade stepped forward impatiently. You can question him all day, Holmes. We've got enough to hold him. Bootprint, pawn ticket. Holmes cut him off with a raised hand. Enough to hold him for theft, certainly. Perhaps enough to hang him for murder, if you are in a hurry to close your ledger. He turned back to Pike. Mr. Pike, you have done work before for gentlemen. Pike's face reddened. I ain't no servant. Holmes's smile was thin. Not a servant, a tool. There is a difference. A servant is valued. A tool is used and discarded. Pike's eyes narrowed. What are you driving at? Holmes stepped closer still, until the two men were separated by no more than a foot of polished stone. His voice dropped, so that only we could hear it. I am driving at this, said Holmes softly. If you are here because someone paid you to be here, then that someone intends you to be the culprit. Your pawn ticket is not evidence of your guilt, it is evidence of your usefulness. And your life expectancy, Mr. Pike, is not improved by your silence. The hall seemed suddenly colder. Pike's bravado faltered. His eyes darted, not to Lestrade now, but to the very walls, as if he feared ears more than men. I ain't saying nothing, he muttered, but his voice had lost its certainty. Holmes straightened, his expression once more indifferent. Very well. Then perhaps your friend will speak for you. Lestrade scowled. Friend? What friend? Holmes did not answer at once. That he had turned, and his eyes were upon the butler. Mr. Rook, he said, you told me the lamp in the hall is usually kept lit through the night. Rook inclined his head. Yes, sir. And yet you could not say with certainty that it was lit when you came down this morning?" Rook's face remained composed. "No, sir." Holmes nodded. "Then perhaps you can say with certainty who is responsible for keeping it lit." "The footman," Rook replied. "Or the housemaid, at times. Whoever is last in the hall." "And who was last in the hall on the night of the murder?" Holmes asked. A faint tightening passed over the butler's mouth. "I could not say." Holmes's gaze held him. "You could not, or you will not?" Lestrade shifted, uncomfortable. "Now see here, Holmes. Rook's been with the family 20 years. He's as steady as they come." "So are clocks," said Holmes. "Yet even clocks may be adjusted." Rook's voice remained steady, but a bead of perspiration glistened near his temple. "I retired at 9:30, sir. I saw Mr. Vane out shortly before. I then went below." Holmes inclined his head. "Below? To the servants' quarters?" "Yes, sir." "And you did not return to this hall at any point?" "No, sir." Holmes' eyes moved with an almost lazy precision to the table where the lamp stood. He crossed to it, lifted the glass chimney, and sniffed delicately at the wick. "It was turned down," he said, almost conversationally. "Not extinguished, turned low. The soot upon the chimney is recent." Lestrade snorted. "What of it? Someone turned it down to save oil." Holmes replaced the chimney. "Perhaps." He turned and looked at Pike again. "Mr. Pike, or did you notice a lamp in the hall?" Pike blinked, startled. He glanced at it now, as if seeing it for the first time. "I don't know." Holmes's voice sharpened. "If you entered the front door, you would know. If you entered the study window, you might not." "Which was it?" Pike swallowed. His eyes darted again, this time up the stairs, as if some unseen person stood upon the landing. "I didn't come in the front," he muttered at last. "I ain't that daft." Holmes nodded once, and in that small gesture I felt the case shift, like a lock turning. "So you came through the garden window," Holmes said. "Good. Then you did not cross this hall at all?" Pike's shoulders hunched. "No." "And therefore," Holmes continued, his voice calm, "you did not make the footstep that was heard twice." Silence fell. Even Lestrade seemed momentarily checked. Vane, at my side, made a faint sound, half relief, half renewed terror, as if the removal of one threat revealed another closer behind it. Holmes' eyes swept the hall once more, taking in the staircase, the lamp, the closed doors, the impassive face of Rook. "Inspector," he said at last, "take your man away. Charge him with theft, certainly. But if you charge him with murder on the strength of that pawn ticket and a footprint, you will do exactly what the murderer intends." Lestrade bristled. "And what do you intend, Holmes?" Holmes' expression was very quiet and very dangerous. "I intend," said he, "to find who needed a footstep to be heard twice, and who needed a signature to be written once." As he spoke, there came from above us the faintest sound, a soft creak, as of someone shifting weight upon a stair. Every head turned. The landing was empty. Yet the house, once again, seemed to have stepped, without showing the foot that moved it. Holmes did not move at once when that sound faded. He stood with his head slightly inclined, his whole body alert, as though the house itself had spoken in a language he alone could translate. Then, very deliberately, he smiled. "Thank you," he murmured, not to any person present, but to the silence itself. Lestrade stared at him. "You heard that, didn't you? Someone's up there." "No," said Holmes calmly. "No one is up there now, but someone was, and wished us to think otherwise." He turned sharply. "Inspector, I must ask you for 5 minutes of your authority, and for the cooperation of everyone in this house. Lock the doors. No one leaves. Lestrade hesitated only a moment before nodding to the constables. I'd do as he says. Holmes looked to me. Watson, if you would be so good as to fetch Mr. Vane and Miss Charters and bring them into the study. When we returned, the study was already transformed. Holmes had drawn the curtains and positioned the lamp so that its light fell harshly upon the desk. Rook stood near the fireplace, rigid and expressionless. Miss Charters sat stiffly in a chair, her hands clenched in her lap. Vane hovered near the door, like a man awaiting sentence. Lestrade leaned against the mantel, scepticism written into every line of him. Holmes stood at the desk, the will spread before him. "Inspector," said Holmes, "you have before you a murder made to resemble a burglary, a forged will made to resemble charity, and a burglar made to resemble a murderer. All very tidy, too tidy." He picked up the will.
This document was signed after Mr. Charter's death. That much is certain. The ink is fresher than the blood upon this rug was when it dried. The signature of Mr. Vane was copied from earlier correspondence. Correspondence accessed not in Lincoln's Inn, but here. Vane gasped. Here? Yes, said Holmes. Your letters to Mr. Charters were kept in this desk. I saw their absence and the faint impression they left upon the blotter. Lestrade frowned. And the witnesses? Holmes inclined his head. One genuine, one forged. Mr. Rook's signature is real? All eyes turned to the butler. Rook did not move. You were devoted to your master, Holmes continued. But devotion curdles when money is dangled just out of reach. You knew the house, its acoustics, its habits.
You knew exactly where to stand on the stair so that a single footstep above would echo as if it were behind a man in the hall. You frightened Mr. Charters with sound alone, made him believe he was followed. Miss Charters sprang up. You mean you tormented him? Holmes's gaze did not leave Rook. Yes. And when Mr. Vane arrived that night, you adjusted the lamp, dimmed it just enough, and waited upon the upper stair. One step carefully placed. Then, when Mr. Vane moved, another. The same stone, the same sound, the house did the rest. Rook's voice was very steady. This is imagination, sir. Holmes smiled thinly. Is it? Then explain why the lamp wick was turned down, not extinguished. Explain why the soot inside the chimney was fresh. Explain why the footstep was heard twice, but never followed by movement. Rook said nothing. Calm, you then went below, Holmes went on, and admitted Mr. Pike through the garden window. You paid him to force the safe and steal the inkstand, an object conspicuous enough to be traced. While he was occupied, you returned upstairs, entered the study, and struck your master from behind. Miss Charters cried out. Vane turned pale. And the will? Lestrade demanded. Holmes lifted the pen from the desk. Written here, later that night. You copied Mr. Vane's hand with care. You had weeks of practice from his letters. You signed your own name boldly. Then you burned the threatening notes in Miss Charters' room, hoping to erase motive, but you overlooked the great. Rook's composure finally cracked. His shoulders sagged, as though some internal support had given way. He was going to dismiss me, he said hoarsely. He said I was no longer necessary. 20 years and cast aside. The money, he laughed bitterly. The money was almost an afterthought. And the footstep? Holmes asked quietly. Rook looked up at him. It was so easy. The stair sings if you know where to stand. Lestrade straightened, his face hard. Rook, you're under arrest. The butler did not resist as the constables took him. As they led him away, the house seemed to exhale, as though relieved of a long-held tension. Miss Charters sank back into her chair, trembling. All this for money. Holmes's voice softened just a little. For fear, said he. Money was merely the excuse. Vane approached him, his face drawn but resolute. "My name?" Holmes folded the will and handed it back. "Will be cleared. The forgery will not withstand examination now that its author has confessed." Lestrade shook his head slowly. "I'll admit it, Holmes. You had it from the start." Holmes smiled faintly. "From the moment a sound was made to mean more than it was." Later, as we walked back through the fog to Baker Street, I remarked upon the strange simplicity of it all. "A house," I said, "a stair, and a footstep." Holmes lit his pipe at last. "The simplest tools," said he, "are often the most effective when used by someone who understands their reach." "And the footstep heard twice?" I asked. He exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke. "A lie repeated," said he, "until it is believed." At Baker Street he paused before going inside. "Come, Watson," he said lightly. "I think we have earned a quiet evening." Yet, as I followed him up the familiar stair, I could not help but listen, half expecting in the hush of the house to hear a sound where no one stood.